In this video, we're going to discuss how to request a reasonable cause abatement from the IRS. This video includes a link to sample letters that you can download and use for your own reasonable cause abatement. The full version of this video or the extended version is available on PassKey online in the bonus videos folder. All right, let's talk about reasonable cause. Now, reasonable cause is when you have a good reason. And these reasons that the IRS has deemed to be reasonable cause reasons are from the IRM or the Internal Revenue Manual. All right, and they're also in the Internal Revenue Code, but there's a lot of situations, as I mentioned before, where the IRS has deemed something to be reasonable cause that wasn't specifically on this list. Now, if you have a situation where you feel like the taxpayer might qualify for reasonable cause, like they have a specific situation that was kind of bad for them, something bad happened to them, and you think that they would qualify for reasonable cause, it never hurts to ask. The worst the IRS can say is no. And it doesn't necessarily hurt any of their chances of getting any other type of penalty abatement if you do ask. Like I said, the worst that the IRS can say is no. And basically, you're back where you started anyway, right? So you didn't really lose anything asking for a penalty abatement via reasonable cause, as long as you're not making a frivolous argument. That's not what I never recommend doing that, where you contact the IRS and say, oh, I have a reasonable cause for not paying my taxes because the IRS is really terrible and I hate you guys. Don't ever do that. That's not a reasonable cause argument that you'd ever be able to get away with. So reasonable cause, according to the IRS, can include death, illness, or unavoidable absence. A death or illness doesn't have to necessarily be the taxpayer themselves. It can also be an immediate family member, like a child or even a parent. So that's a reasonable cause argument that you can make. And generally, you do that by writing a letter to the IRS and requesting abatement under reasonable cause for death, illness, or unavoidable absence. This is the first on the list. This is one of those situations where if you have a death, a serious illness, or an unavoidable absence, then generally the IRS is going to abate. Okay, if you ask, you have to ask. This is not a situation where it's automatic. Okay, reasonable cause is not automatic. You have to ask. Okay, you got to put your hand out, right? Now, unavoidable absence can include something like jail, internment in a drug treatment facility. Those were two examples that I found in IRS guidance on the IRS website. Amazingly enough, I did see another one where the IRS used an example of being kidnapped in a foreign nation and held for ransom. If it's on there, that means that it actually happened. And that would technically be an unavoidable absence, right? If somebody kidnapped me in a foreign nation and held me for ransom, then that would be an unavoidable absence, and I probably wouldn't be thinking very much about filing my tax returns if that was happening to me. So those are reasonable cause arguments, okay? Now, fire, casualty, or natural disaster is the next one on the list. Now, natural disaster, fire, or other casualty can be a reasonable cause exception. Now, the IRS will determine, or you can present this argument, whether the taxpayer is eligible for relief under an official disaster area, a federally declared disaster. If it's a federally declared disaster area, then the taxpayer is affected by that, right? Their home was in that federally declared disaster, their business was, whatever, then that's an automatic abatement and it's a statutory exception. But not every single natural disaster is going to be a federally declared disaster area. And as I mentioned earlier, you can have a casualty that just happens to you. You can have a fire that just burns down your house, or maybe your house and your neighbor's house. You can have a mudslide that just wipes out one street, and your house unfortunately happens to be on that street. But that's not going to be a federally declared disaster, right? It's a disaster, but it's a disaster for you. not a lot of other people in the same disaster. So in that case, if a taxpayer is not in an official disaster area, a FEMA disaster, then the occurrence does not automatically provide penalty relief. That means you still have to ask for it. It's not just, you don't just get a statutory exception. Okay. Now, unable to obtain records is another one for reasonable cause. A good example of this would be, for example, the death of a taxpayer's accountant. Maybe you have an accountant that's doing all your books and records, something like that. And all of a sudden, the accountant dies. And they've had your books and records, they've been doing your bookkeeping and everything else. And now that the IRS has all of these security laws in place and all these security rules, maybe it's a situation where someone goes in and notices that the accountant has all of these passwords on their laptop, and you can't get your QuickBooks file anymore or your Sage file anymore. You can't get your payroll records anymore, any of that. So that's a situation where the taxpayer would be unable to obtain records, and that's reasonable cause too. We had a post on a recent Facebook group that I belong to, which are all tax professionals, and this had happened, and the accountant had taken over. The other accountant died. The taxpayer came to them and said, "Oh, we formed an LLC last year, and it was a multi-member LLC, so it was more than one member, which kind of complicates things because at that point, the taxpayer didn't know whether it was a partnership, an MLLC, or an S corp, because apparently the taxpayer had requested an S corp election, but the accountant died, so they don't know if that was ever done. And contacting the IRS right now, the S corp department, the department at the IRS that processes S corp elections, is a dumpster fire. Can't get a hold of anybody. You don't know what's going on. Some of the elections are being processed and some of them aren't. You don't know. So at that point, the taxpayer didn't know what to do. And I responded to the post and I said, look, this is reasonable cause. This is ideal situation for reasonable cause. Because the taxpayer was going to get hit with penalties for late filing. And then, of course, the entity was probably going to get hit with penalties for late filing too. They weren't even sure what kind of an entity it was at that point. So that's textbook reasonable cause. And I said, look, file the returns, contact the IRS, get the best information that you can, find out what they have on file. If there's no S corp election on file it as a partnership because that's the best you got. It's already too late. And, do the best you can. And when they do get their penalty notice, because it's coming, then request abatement under reasonable cause because they were unable to obtain records. And then there was a death. It wasn't the taxpayer's death or the death of an immediate family member, but it was the death of their accountant, their longtime accountant. So that's going to be an automatic abatement. They're going to be able to get those penalties abated. But in that case, you got to file those returns, wait for the notice to come, and then request penalty abatement. Okay, at that point. And that's reasonable cause. It's going to be an ideal scenario for reasonable cause, but you have to ask. Somebody's going to have to write a letter at that point. Okay. Erroneous advice or reliance on a tax professional, ignorance of the law, forgetfulness, and others based on facts and circumstances. Forgetfulness could include something like Alzheimer's, or a person who might have like the early stages of that, where they haven't really been diagnosed yet with any kind of late stage dementia or Alzheimer's. They can still live in their own home, but they're kind of getting really forgetful. In the past, I've had success just requesting a reasonable cause abatement when, in my case, it was a taxpayer who was in his 90s already. And generally, if it's a taxpayer in their 80s or 90s and they've had a late filing or they're late to pay, if they're late to pay their quarterlies or whatever, generally, based on the taxpayer's age, the IRS is pretty lenient. In my, I don't know what will happen in your case, but in my experience, the IRS has been pretty lenient. If you have somebody who's elderly with a reasonable cause abatement for forgetfulness, okay? I don't know if you'll have as much luck, if they're like 26, but if they're 80, 90, I've always had good luck, okay? With the forgetfulness arguments, okay? All right. This last link is an IRS publication, basically, that explains reasonable cause arguments. You can look, they're all on that list. And it also is really useful because it provides like the actual sites that you might need if you need to reference a particular site in order to put that in your letter. Okay? Let me give you a reasonable cause example. John is married and has always filed jointly with his wife, Mary, who he has been happily married to for 20 years. However, Mary is diagnosed with a serious illness in 2020. John is so distraught and can barely function. Mary is too sick to do anything, and John does not file the 2020 return or his 2021 return. She can't do anything, she's sick, and John kind of loses his mind a little bit, and he's totally focused on his wife who might die. She's very sick. So he doesn't file 2020 and 2021. Okay, because the illness began in 2020. So he didn't file 2 years in a row. After a long battle with this illness, Mary finally recovers in 2022. In 2022, they receive letters from the IRS demanding tax returns. They finally go to see Shannon, an enrolled agent. Shannon files both 2020 and 2021 for John and Mary. So they have 2 delinquent tax years, okay? Both years have an amount due. If they were owed a refund, then they wouldn't need to worry about requesting a reasonable cause abatement or any kind of an abatement because they would just be getting money back. But since they owed money both of those years, then the IRS is going to assess a failure to file penalty because they didn't file, a failure to pay penalty because they didn't pay, and then interest on the amount due. Okay, so that's what they want to get abated. They're still going to owe the tax, all right? But they can get the failure to file penalty and the failure to pay penalty abated if they qualify under the reasonable cause exceptions. So Shannon submits the returns, and a few months later, the IRS sends John and Mary 2 letters reflecting large penalties for failure to file, that's the FTF, and failure to pay and interest on the amount that they owe. Shannon gets a power of attorney, that's the enrolled agent, and requests abatement for both years under reasonable cause due to severe spousal illness. The abatement is granted. John and Mary will still owe the tax as well as interest, but they will not have to pay the failure to file or the failure to pay penalty. And sometimes these can be huge. I'm going to show you an example. All right, so I'm going to show you what a penalty abatement letter looks like. Okay, and once you get that notice from the IRS that shows the penalties that have been assessed against the taxpayer, then you can draft the letter. And when you send it in, you're going to want to make sure that you include a copy of the notice. And unless you're the taxpayer responding for yourself, if you're representing a taxpayer, you also need to include the power of attorney, the 2848, along with the letter. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like. So I'm going to give you a copy of this as a Word doc so that you can adjust it to fit your own client. Okay, so I put everything in here, but this actually shows you where you would put all of the numbers and the addresses and the names and everything else. Okay, so in that example that I was giving you earlier of the Mary and John Smith, where Mary was sick, what you want to do is at the top, this is the way I format mine, by the way. You know, there's going to be other sample letters that I'm going to show you where you can format them a little bit differently, but the gist has to be basically the same. The IRS is obsessed with procedure, so if you send in a letter, it really needs to include all of this information. Okay? So you put the date that you're mailing the letter or completing the letter, whatever, today's date, the current date. You put Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service, and then whatever address is at the top of the notice, you would put that here. Okay, because you know the IRS has multiple different campuses, right? All these IRS campuses in different states, and you're going to want to make sure that you respond to the notice to whatever address is on the notice, whatever IRS campus is on the notice. Okay, all right. The taxpayer's name, it's not necessarily going to be the same address where you filed the tax return. All right, that's what I want you to understand. Okay, the taxpayer's name, if it's a joint return, you put both of the taxpayers' names, and this is regardless if they're divorced now or regardless if they're separated now. It's regardless if you're only representing one of them, that doesn't matter. Okay, you need to put both of the taxpayers' name that were on the actual return. If it was a joint return, you put them both there, as well as the social security numbers of both taxpayers. Whoever is listed primary on the return, that's who you list primary on the letter. Okay, whoever's the primary taxpayer on the return. Doesn't matter if it's the husband or the wife, all right, or the spouse if it's a same-sex couple. It doesn't matter which spouse is listed first. That doesn't matter. But when you send in the letter, regardless of who you're actually representing, if you're representing just one of them or if you're representing them both, you list it on the letter the way it is on the tax return. Okay? All right. So John and Mary Smith, married couple, SSN, whatever it is, and then you list primary taxpayer. SSN, whatever that is, for the secondary taxpayer. Okay, in this case, John, he's the primary. Mary is the secondary. Okay? You put the form number that it applies to. If it's an individual taxpayer, it's going to be either the Form 1040, the Form 1040-NR if it's a non-resident alien, or it could potentially be a very old tax return, right? Back when we were still using the 1040A, remember that? Or the 1040EZ, those were all tax returns in the past, and they haven't been retired for very long, all right? So you want to put the form number that the taxpayers actually filed, okay? Most of what you're going to see on here is Form 1040, but remember that's not the only type of form that it's in the 1040 series, okay? So it could potentially be an NR, non-resident, potentially be a 1040 SR for seniors. That's a relatively new form. So you want to put the right one on there. And then whatever tax year it applies to, whatever tax year the notice applies to, sometimes taxpayers will get multiple notices for multiple tax years. Whatever year you're responding to, you put it there. The notice number, it'll be at the top of the notice, and then the notice date, the date that's listed on the notice. You put to whom it may concern. Sometimes the notices will actually have an IRS employee listed on there, the name. If there's a name of an IRS employee, then you go to Mr. or Mrs., whatever it is. We respectfully request that the failure to file, failure to pay, and failure to pay estimated tax penalty, if all of these apply, you can put them all on there, okay? Sometimes it'll only be one or the other, and you can request abatement for any or all of these, okay? Failure to file, failure to pay, and failure to pay estimated tax penalty be abated based on IRM 20.1.1.3.2. That's the section in the Internal Revenue Manual for reasonable cause. Okay. The taxpayers apologize for the late filing and late payment of tax. You always want to be very apologetic and polite. Don't be rude. Be nice. You catch a lot more flies with honey than with vinegar. And remember, these are going to be individual human beings that are going to be opening these letters. So you want to be nice and polite. Mr., Mrs., sincerely, thank you very much, please and please. All right? Okay. So the taxpayers apologize for the late filing and late payment of tax. The reason was due to the severe disease or illness of Mary Smith, okay, who only recovered in 2022 after a protracted and painful convalescence. We have included a copy of medical records. Since this is, you're requesting abatement under reasonable cause, it really helps to have some proof, okay? Mr. and Mrs. Smith sincerely apologize for this oversight. They hope that you will consider abatement of the penalties for reasonable cause. If you have any questions, feel free to call me directly at da-da-da-da-da. If you're representing the taxpayer, you're going to want to put your number there, all right? Not the taxpayer's number if you're representing them, all right? Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Shannon Jones, EA. So you would put whatever your title is as the representative there. And you always want to include the attachments. So you include a copy of the actual notice if you're representing the taxpayer, and you are going to include a POA, which is the Form 2848, and then any relevant documents to support a reasonable cause abatement. All right? Okay. Okay, so here's a sample of a CP14 notice. And this is right off of the IRS website, so you can see what it looks like. So as you can see, John and Mary Smith right here, I took names off of here, and this is a sample of a notice. They're usually about 6 to 8 pages long, and they explain all the taxpayers' rights and what they have to do and who they have to contact. As you can see at the top here, this is the address of the IRS campus that sent out this notice, and this is the same address that you would respond to if you were responding to this notice as a representative. The notice number is up here, the tax year is up here, the notice date is up here. All of this information you can get off of the notice itself, okay? And then it'll always have the taxpayers' names right up there. And as you can see, these are how the penalties are broken down. All right, and this is going to vary based on how much the taxpayer owes, how late the return was, whether they're self-employed or not, because if they're not self-employed, then there's less of a chance that they're going to have an estimated tax penalty, failure to pay estimated tax, that sort of thing. So all of these numbers are going to vary a lot based on the taxpayer situation, okay? But regardless of the taxpayer situation, no matter how much money it is, if the taxpayer qualifies for an FTA or a reasonable cause or one of those other statutory exceptions where, for example, if they're in a combat zone or if they were in a federally declared disaster area and you could prove it, then those are all situations where you could request all of these penalties to be abated. In this case, for example, if these people were eligible for either an FTA or a reasonable cause abatement or something like that, you can see right here, these penalties, failure to file, failure to pay, these would be able to be abated. These would qualify for abatement, as well as the failure to pay estimated tax penalty. This would also qualify for an abatement. The one that wouldn't qualify for an abatement under reasonable cause or FTA, or even most of those statutory exceptions, would be the interest charges. So generally, it's extremely difficult to abate interest, and generally you can only have interest abated is if the IRS actually made a mistake. So it would have to be an IRS error in that case. It's let's not say that it never happens, but it happens only very rarely. But all of these other penalties, failure to file, failure to pay, and failure to pay estimated tax, those all would qualify for all of those abatements: FTA, reasonable cause, and statutory exceptions. Okay, so never hurts to ask. People, never hurts to ask. The worst the IRS can say is no. Now, the other links on this slide are public penalty abatement letters that you can download as samples for yourself. Now, sometimes these will disappear off the web. I have a lot of these saved in my favorites, but there's no guarantee that these websites are going to keep these fantastic letters up and available to the public. I don't include them. I only include the links because I don't own the copyright to any of these. Okay. These are sample penalty abatement letters from the AICPA and some other organizations, but they are free for download. They're freely available. I suggest that you download these and save them to your hard drive, even if you don't immediately need them now, because they can be very useful. So this is a sample penalty abatement letter from the AICPA for a first time abatement, an FTA. This is a COVID penalty abatement, which has the specific language for the COVID penalty abatement for COVID-19. This is another one for FTA and reasonable cause. This is for both, because remember, FTA is a first-time abatement, which is different than reasonable cause. FTA you can only ask for once every 3 years, but you could potentially have a situation where you could ask for reasonable cause multiple years in a row. You know, if you have a person whose house gets destroyed by a hurricane this year, and their house got destroyed by a different hurricane the previous year. I've actually seen that, unfortunately, for that poor taxpayer. Their house got destroyed by a hurricane one year. They moved to a new place, and that new house got destroyed by a hurricane the following year in a different state by a different hurricane. So in that case, they would qualify for a statutory exception for the first hurricane, and then they would qualify in the next year for a statutory exception for the second hurricane. I know it's horrible, but it's like, how much bad luck could you possibly have? But in that case, they would qualify for reasonable cause year after year after year. So potentially you could have a situation where you ask for reasonable cause for multiple years in a row, depending on the taxpayer's amount of bad luck, their particular situation. But an FTA is like once every 3 years, and that's all you get. Okay? All right. So FTA and reasonable cause template here. All right. And then there's another one here from an attorney's office, which is also public. And that's a great one because it lists many different types of reasonable cause abatements, and you can just kind of like delete the ones that you don't need. Okay. So I do recommend that you download all of those and save them to your hard drive for when you might need them at a later date. All right. The end. That's the end. Be sure to check out all of our other educational webinars. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.